It's assets, not wealth, that change the trajectory of families. Public assets are far cheaper ways, more reliable ways to give that stability and access to the middle class to far larger numbers of people. So I have become a hardened advocate for public assets. I happen to work in one that is public education, but I can't look at what's happening in public education right now and not think about the more fundamental disagreement we're having right now about the value of public assets.
Welcome to Small Acts of Rebellion, a podcast where the unspoken narratives at the intersection of our personal and professional lives come to light. I'm your host, Heather Pridemore, your guide on this journey of discovery and defiance. Join me as we uncover the rebellious spirit that shapes our careers and lives. It's time to own your story. Are you ready?
Today's guest is Gretchen Morgan, managing partner at the Center for Innovation in Education, where she and her team lead efforts within and across states focused on learner-centered assessment for learning, family partnership, and inclusive design. Critical foundations for rebuilding public trust and reimagining school and district accountability. Previously, Gretchen served as president of CareerWise Colorado, leading the launch of a statewide youth apprenticeship system. She also held the role of Associate Commissioner of Innovation at the Colorado Department of Education, where she oversaw strategic initiatives such as the development of an assessment pilot, the advancement of competency-based learning, and oversight of charter schools, post-secondary readiness, and student re-engagement programs. Her career in education spans a wide range of roles, including principal, curriculum and program developer, instructional and leadership coach, and elementary school teacher. Welcome to the show, Gretchen.
Thank you. I'm super happy to be here.
So, Gretchen, I always like to talk first about how I meet people that I bring on the show. You and I actually met at I'll call it a think tank, and it was about sort of alternative approaches to education. And I had just happened to meet somebody who thought it might be fun to have me at this conversation. And even though I don't personally consider myself any kind of education subject matter expert, I can't tell you how interesting it was to be in that room with all of those different thinkers and talk about like what education might look like if we approached it different, if we funded it differently, if we assessed it differently, how might we get people more involved in the conversation of education. And so I just thought that was like a really cool place to meet you. But then you and I started talking and I was like, I have to have Gretchen on the show. So I'm so glad that you're here.
Thanks, Heather. It's great to be with you. And yeah, that was a really interesting conversation. That was a space created by a group of educators in Denver who frequently try to create spaces like that, actually, where they bring together folks who wouldn't normally come together to just dig into some interesting question, or in that case, it was to react to a little bit of a harebrained idea that some folks have been cooking up to see what people could do to help them develop that. And it's a pretty cool thing, actually, about educators that they're willing to do that. I think those guys never have a hard time finding people, to come part of kind of weirdo conversations. And I never say no unless I'm out of town because they're fun.
But yeah, no, it was a lot of fun. I was telling other people about it. I was like, this was such a cool approach to brainstorming and sort of assessing an idea. And I always get really excited around novelty and innovation. There were definitely some people who presented ideas or perspectives, and I was like, that's like a really interesting way to connect things or to get people to get involved or to think about this topic who might not otherwise think that they have any sort of stake in the situation. And so some really interesting conversations there. But one of the things that stood out to me, not only that day when I met you, Gretchen, but in a couple of our subsequent conversations, is just your breadth of knowledge in the education space. And so because you've spent so much of your career working at this intersection of education, systems change, and community engagement, I thought a really good place for us to start our conversation would be for you just to walk us through your professional journey and talk about how that's unfolded and then what experiences you feel have really shaped your path so far.
Yeah, I always sort of dread getting questions like this because I'm sort of an old lady and it's a long story at this point. I started teaching the same time as a lot of my peers who are very interested actually in education as like sort of an engine of equity in communities and broadly in American democracy. That was like why we became teachers. We wanted to do something better than what our education systems had been doing before, take advantage of a public asset that existed and make it be something that served everybody better, served everybody well. We have an education system that still produces and reproduces quite a bit of inequality and inequity and doesn't actually serve or treat everybody well. And now it's in an era of sort of political attack. It's become a public asset that is convenient to pick on to try and devalue public assets more broadly. I got into this because I really believed in what we could do in public education, which I still do. I'm not jaded. I'm still after it. But that very purpose for being an educator is actually threatened right now. I'm glad I'm still around and I'm still in the game. So a few things that have shaped me. So I was a teacher first, which I think is appropriate, and taught third, fourth, and fifth grade students here in Denver at the Rocky Mountain School of Expeditionary Learning. It was a great place to teach because it suited me well. There's not like a kind of school that works for all students. There's also not a single kind of school that works for all teachers. And so Remsel was a really good fit for me as a teacher. I wanted to be a project-based learning teacher. I wanted to take my students out into the world, and we had a little fleet of minibuses and vans, and we took kids out. I took my students out almost every week, every year into the field to be learning in a place with somebody, with someone who had real lived experience or expertise that we didn't have inside our classroom. So it was a good fit for me. And I really enjoyed it. And I started doing other things when I was there that led me into all this other stuff. While I was there, I discovered I was really good at creating school schedules, which is a quirky thing and probably not a thing that a lot of listeners are like, oh, say more. But it's important in my story, I think, because it was the first time I realized what my particular strength was in my field, which was thinking about humans and systems at the same time. Schedules are a representation of that. They're often a really terrible representation of that. And so from there, I got into working for Expeditionary Learning, the national organization where I coached teachers and supported leaders, but I also built systems for new high schools. And that led me into other positions, like at the state agency, right, the Colorado Department of Education, where I was looking at this from a systems level down and out to the field and starting to contemplate things like policy. As a teacher, I thought about policy as a thing I needed to understand. And also, I was not going to be limited by. I was going to be creative in how I responded to complying with policy. So it was a strange turn for me to go to the state agency where like our job is basically making people accountable to policy, but that's just not how I played there. I became pretty quickly someone who was inside the agency advocating for folks doing interesting, responsive things to serve young people better than they'd been doing, who was willing to advocate internally. And I promoted that. My boss promoted that. And I ran around the agency doing things to try and help us figure out, like, even though we've said no to this thing 100 times, they want to do something interesting. Is it really not okay? There's regulation and then there's how regulation's been implemented. And lots of times there's actually quite a distance between those two things. My job there was facilitating that, stepping in and being a partner to teams so that they did their work more innovatively. I became like a little innovative sidecar to a couple of teams at the department, and then led work that was around graduation. Next Gen Learning was kind of the headline of that work, but basically it was like, what are the essential skills young people need when they leave our school system? We agreed on a set of those by building them collaboratively with the field, which included not just educators, obviously, like there were parents there, there were employers there. Yes, there were also students there. And yes, there were also teachers and principals and others there. But it really was a large inclusive group that helped us define those competencies, identify them and define them, and talk about what the implications were. Like, if we care about these competencies, what would we have to do differently? Which actually led to us pursuing changes in assessment. This is all like, I don't know, maybe nerdy and not that interesting, but that's how systems change happens, I think, in big public systems like this. You do something engaged with users. Users tell you something. They indicate that something needs to be different or could be different, right? Sometimes it's really negative, but sometimes it's actually quite hopeful. The conversation about essential skills was very hopeful from people. And then they ask you and you ask them, how might we go about working on that? And then you work it. You figure out, like, we changed some policy. We also changed the way we behaved at the department. We also changed sometimes the parameters around competitive funds that people were getting in the state. and we changed the supports we provided to the field. And I think ultimately that's how things change. But if you don't do it in partnership with folks that are going to be impacted, then you're probably doing it wrong. And you're also building in resistance to whatever you're doing from the start. At the same time that I was doing that work there, for example, we had policy passed in the state, the educator effectiveness policy, that required that state test scores were used as part of teacher evaluation. And there was a lot of engagement after the legislation was passed to get teachers to figure out how they would be comfortable with that. And to be honest, the state law was not a big change actually, in that, you know, the amount of data, like this data did have to be there, but it didn't have to be like anything more than a few percentage points of someone's evaluation. So it wasn't like a huge change, but because of the way it happened in the legislature, there was resistance to it immediately. Maybe there would have been anyway, but I just think if you do things fast, when you have political power to do them, you immediately build resistance to those things themselves. And so you're better off working with the field and community so that when something goes to the legislature, it's their idea. And I don't mean that in a placating, manipulative way. I mean it very sincerely. Like, it is, they have participated, you have participated together, you have formulated an idea that you think is better. When that goes to the legislature, the chances of it being implemented with care and curiosity and support are just much higher.
Well, there's a couple things there, though, I think are worth kind of plucking at a little bit, Gretchen. And so I just want to start actually where you finished, because what you're talking about, this idea about getting people sort of involved, on board, you know, really thinking through too a change. I mean, I can't tell you how often we see in lots of different spaces, corporate spaces, family spaces, where someone decides that something is going to happen, but they don't really think about the domino effect or what like operationalizing or actually making the change looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And things can get like crazy or go awry very quickly because you don't either have the right resources or you don't have people bought in. And so, I mean, yeah, systems aren't always sexy. I mean, for people like you and me, we like systems, you know, and as you were talking, I was thinking about all of the layered systems that are in an education space,
Mm-hmm.
you know, because it's not just the administrative systems, it's not just the political systems, but even in the classroom, right? We're designing curriculum and we're doing all kinds of different things. And so there's all these different systems kind of layered in. And when they're stacked together, that creates a very specific experience for the student.
Mm-hmm.
That creates a very specific experience for the parents of students, right? And so all these things kind of come together. And so it might not, like, at the surface, first of all, I point all that out because I just don't think people probably spend that much time thinking about these things, right? Like, if you're not someone who's in a space where there are a lot of systems, or if you're not someone who's particularly invested in the idea of like the education system, you're probably not thinking about the complexity of this. But I think it is a really timely period to consider all these systems because of what we see currently unfolding. Because, I mean, anyone who is a parent, is thinking about being a parent, you know, and has a kid maybe going into the education system, like, it's kind of worth taking just like a pause and like thinking about the complexity of all of these elements. And so, I mean, yeah, it might not be sexy, but like it is relevant and it can be very interesting when you can find an entry point to the conversation.
And can I just build on something you said there?
Yeah.
So when you start talking about the different components of the system and how they kind of wrap around each other, we have some good friends at the Deeper Learning Dozen, and they talk about systemic symmetry. And they don't talk about it as an aspiration. They talk about it as a truth you need to grapple with. As in, the way that you imagine the classroom will be, at some point, due to the inertia and skill of the system, aligned with how you think about how you treat teachers, will be aligned with how you think about curriculum decisions, will be aligned with how you govern your district, will be aligned with the sort of disposition of policies that are written to guide and shape that system. And it's helpful, I think, to understand that because, as you said, education is complex, and like, it's such a stinker that it is. Like, it would be really cool if there was like one right idea. You just train everybody and then it would totally work. The reality is, little humans who are learning are themselves complex. They will often need different things from one another to learn the same thing. But also the humans implementing this, teachers and educators and volunteers working in schools, are also distinct, and they will need different things to do their best job at whatever's going on, whatever you're trying to do. And the sort of inherent complexity of the situation means that there aren't silver bullets, there aren't like super clear singular solutions, but we really want them because we really want our schools to be good, right? It's a very understandable temptation. But when you think about symmetry, you realize that it doesn't work, right? Like you can buy a really great curriculum. We've done this a lot of times to try and fix things, we're going to buy awesome curriculum. And even right now, there's been a pretty significant shift in our field around the science of reading, with people actually paying attention to brain science and figuring out what that means about how reading develops in most young minds and the supports needed. Understanding, of course, that there's some differentiation around and within that space, but basically calling us out and saying our field was ignoring a part of literacy development that's been creating problems for a lot of students. And so we need to be really learning about and doing a good job with the science of reading. Cool. Buy science of reading curriculum, train teachers on science of reading curriculum. They go in, they follow the curriculum, and something doesn't work, right? Like they maybe didn't get it right. Maybe it wasn't actually the right fit for 3 of the 26 kids in their room or whatever it was. And if there isn't support right there with that teacher in that moment, it's very easy for them to lose faith in the curriculum tool. Full symmetry situation, then they are being guided as learners just as they're being asked to guide children as learners, right? Which just means a whole different level of support, but also different assumptions about them. You need to assume actually that they have agency, that teachers are going to see things in the classroom, they're going to need to respond, they're going to need to adapt. So if you require as part of your implementation that there is no adaptation because it is perfect, your science of reading curriculum is, perfection. If that's what you assume, teachers will undermine its implementation in trying to be responsive to students, right? So if your assumption about how literacy works is utterly uniform and you teach teachers to be totally uniform, that'll be rejected because there's already something going on there that's not in symmetry with that, right? So on the other hand, if you want to change a learning environment, you want to make the science of reading awesome, you want to make the science of reading something that works for all the kids in the classroom, you're going to have to do much more differentiated work with teachers so they can be agentic users who will customize and adapt, but customize and adapt in ways that are smart, right? Like I don't have the deepest background in the science of reading. You actually shouldn't just give me free rein to go adapting science of reading curriculum. You need to teach me how and why it was built so that I can make good decisions using it to be responsive to learners. But if policy says you can choose from these 2 programs, you must implement them on this timeline, you must implement them with fidelity, then you're assuming the classroom is a simpler place than it is, and that you're trying to have a certain kind of symmetry and it will fail. So what is the symmetry that you need? What do you want the classroom to look like? And then how does everything else have to line up with that, mimic that, enable that? Otherwise, your change is just going to fall flat.
I'm going to pivot here in a second, Gretchen, but I do just want to point out for those listening, like this idea of symmetry that you're talking about, while you're talking about it in like an education space, I could see how this same sort of set of challenges takes place in other ecosystems as well. And a lot of what I hear you talking about, or at least the way I'm interpreting it, is like I hear a lot of really the requirements on leadership. And so, when I think about my own background in the corporate spaces, I can't tell you how many times people would launch some new idea and it wasn't perfect, but they launched it like it was and then left no room for adaptability, that sort of thing. Given all the work that you've done, right? So working with educators, participating with families, interacting with policy leaders, you've had a broad systems level view. And so what I'm really wondering about is your perspective on the current moment in public education.
So I think we've been building toward this current moment since the 80s, actually, in public education. There was a big report written, A Nation at Risk, right? It's like in the Reagan era. And A Nation at Risk pointed out that like our students are not as good at Chinese students at math, and we're at risk, in terms of international competition and such. And we tried to do some things in response to that. And actually there was a big bargain made between Republicans and Democrats at the time to start doing a lot of standardized testing. And everybody wanted to do it for different reasons, but everybody wanted to do it. So if you're a Democrat, you're really interested in equity, and you're pretty sure there's inequity in our system, but we actually don't have data to show where the inequity is, how great the inequity is, how persistent it is. You want standardized test data to illuminate those inequities and cause us all to be more accountable to the young people and communities we're not serving well. If you're on the Republican side, you might have wanted it because you realize this is a gigantic public expenditure. We should have data to evaluate the degree to which this giant investment is yielding outcomes. You might also have believed at that time, if you were in a smaller group, in my estimation, that if you gathered data and you could show over and over again how underperforming, unresponsive our public education system was, then you could make arguments over and over again to privatize that system, which you might want to do fundamentally because you just believe private education works better. You might also want to do because you benefit from a version of America where we have lower taxes and fewer public assets. Really wealthy people benefit from systems like that. Everybody else, all the rest of us, benefit from a system where we have strong public assets. There's some folks called the Institute for the Future, super like design thinking futurist nerds. They're in Palo Alto, and I had an opportunity to meet them a few years ago and learn about some of their work evaluating this, in particular, evaluating the difference between wealth and assets for individuals and the difference between private and public assets, how those change things. And what I took away from their very complex work was it's assets, not wealth, that change the trajectory of families. Public assets are far cheaper ways, more reliable ways to give that stability and access to the middle class to far larger numbers of people. So I have become a hardened advocate for public assets. I happen to work in one that is public education, but I can't look at what's happening in public education right now and not think about the more fundamental disagreement we're having right now about the value of public assets. And the reason I say this goes back to Reagan, beyond just a nation at risk, is Reagan was really, I think, in my own experience as a kid at that time, I think he's one of the first successful American politicians to really argue and persuade people against their own self-interest. I think he persuaded a lot of people of middle and low income that lower taxes was going to benefit them. And it's just not actually true. And this whole conversation is further complicated by really disgusting things about racial inequity in our country, right? Like, we have a history of deciding to devalue certain public assets the second people of color get broad access to them. The historical example people talk about a lot is integration of public swimming pools. As soon as those became integrated spaces where Black people were welcome to swim with everybody else, white people were like, you know what I want? I want private swimming pools, right? We had this huge boom in private swim clubs and like swim and tennis clubs all over America. And eventually then people are like, why am I investing in this public pool? I've got this other one down the street that I'm a member of, right? So because we decided that was an asset for a certain group of folks, we then decide it's not an important asset, and then we devalue it. And so, I think you could make the argument that we're seeing the same sort of thing happen around public education right now. We have in the big, beautiful bill, which is hard for me to say without, I don't know, making weird facial expression or spitting or something. One of the things that's in there is a national voucher program. The national voucher program is designed to primarily give a giant tax shelter so that people with a lot of money can give money to it and write it off in their taxes. Secondly, it gives families access to that money, but there's some things in the design of the bill that we're actually still trying to sort out that may actually constrain people's access to it below a certain income level. And we've also seen like where voucher programs have happened inside states. Primarily, people who already have their kids outside the system use those programs to get money to pay for where they're already going into private systems. So it's not a thing that is built to enable families who are being underserved, right? Let's say you have a student with special needs, you have a student with an IEP, an individual education plan. We are historically and currently not great at meeting the needs of students with learning differences, neurodiversity, reading disabilities, all kinds of things. And when talking about things like this national voucher program or talking about state voucher programs that have happened before, people talk about them sometimes as things that are going to help those families go get the support they need when the system is not responsive to them. And I'm actually deeply empathetic to that perspective. Like, I have a kid myself who we had to spend a lot of money outside of the public school system to help them learn to read fluently. And I wanted their school to be more responsive, and it didn't happen. And that was a travesty, and it happens all the time. And yet, the way this voucher program is created, that's not the thing it's actually designed to address in a specific way, right? And so you have to sort of wonder, like, how much is this just the sort of growing legacy of Reagan and people saying, you know what, I want to create a tax shelter for wealthy people, and I want to create a way for wealthy people to get out of this public system. Because you know what we've been doing? We've been really trying explicitly to make this public system more responsive to communities of color and communities of poverty. That makes me not like it that much, just like swimming pools, right? Like, now that that system is really trying to serve those kids, it must not be cool for me anymore. So unfortunately, it's like some of the grossest stuff in our American identity plays out in this space with this, I think, treasured public asset. And so I think we find ourselves now, if you are an equity-minded person who cares about public education, that's one thing. But also, if you're an equity-minded person who cares about access to middle class, stability and safety of middle class in our country, it behooves you to look at all these things in more than just a personal opportunistic way, but to think about them as things that have communal impact.
Now, you and I had talked briefly before, Gretchen, about the voucher program. And one of the things I had sort of posed to you as a question was like, education has also been one of those components of like me showing you how sort of affluent I am. And so, when you send your kids to private schools, you are able to say like, oh, well, my kid goes to this like fancy school. And so that's just a way of me sort of indicating to you that I am of a certain class. Now with this voucher program and sort of the superficiality of the ability for anyone to send their kids anywhere, it does start to disrupt, I think, components of the existing system. But I was just hoping that you might elaborate a little bit on like what we had talked about as far as how this might impact marginalized communities now that this like voucher program is going into play, when the people who could already afford to go to the best schools are still going to be able to afford to go to the best schools.
Yeah, and those schools, and best, I would put in air quotes because that's a qualified term. It's, what are you looking for from your school, right? If you're looking for a place that separates you and makes you feel exclusive, then they're awesome. They may also be academically awesome. They may also have great, business partners. They may have lots of other opportunities. But what is it that really is your selection criteria is important. And, those schools that are offering status right now may just charge more. Like, honestly, if I ran one of those schools, I'd be like, hey, we had this great group of people coming here for 30 grand a year, and now the voucher's going to give X amount more. I think we should just make our tuition, half the voucher more. And so I think you may just see some inflation at the high end, which would be, I guess, sort of whatever, I think because of the difference between what you could pay for with the voucher and what it takes to be an elite school, there is still going to be a separation, right? So I think we try very often in our country to use policy change and structural change to fortify or stimulate societal change. And that's not wrong. We should totally do that because we have a bunch of inequities. So like I'm into using those things to try and provoke that. But I think the voucher programs are going to be interesting to watch in that I think unless someone does something in particular, it will be a great way to reinforce the stratification that we already have. There'll be public schools where people go that are less and less well-funded, that have less and less support, do a less and less good job, continue to be subjected, by the way, to testing and reporting so the performance can be made public over and over and over and over again. Which, again, if you care about equity, you want, but also if you want to punish systems, you also want. So, like, how and why are we doing that? And then there's going to be like low cost private options that don't have any testing, that are not overseen in any way. And the only way we know whether people like them or not is how often they stay or leave them. And that we only know because of the number of like voucher reimbursements that they submit, right? And even that will be up to the discretion of whoever this nonprofit is who will operate this program inside states, which there's a lot about that we don't know. There's a lot of regs to be written. We don't even know how that's going to work yet. Then there'll be these late private things, right? That exist now, that cost more, that will continue to cost more, that there will be no increased access to. And so, you know, in this case, I think this policy was created to reinforce stratification. I actually think it was crafted to do that quite intentionally. But even when we try not to do that, unless we actually take on the values issues and the behavior issues while trying to change these structural things, we tend to just replicate it, right? So I do think an interesting question right now is like, okay, this voucher program was created to further stratify things. It was created to pull money out of a system that serves people who can't afford something different or who are just committed to a community school. And there are people who are committed to that for personal reasons because they feel connection in their community, right? But that system is going to be losing and losing and losing money because it's going to be losing and losing students. This other money is going to be flooding over here. It was built for all that. Okay. So how might someone use it toward a different end? So like the first question, which I think is the easier one to answer, is how might some communities use this to better serve their underserved communities? Like if I am a parent with a student with special needs, you know, who might I become arm in arm with to create a something that really does exactly what we want or need? And how could I utilize this system to create that? Or if I'm an educator who's passionate about it, you know, to create it to serve a certain group of kids who I know have been underserved. Black and brown communities may well do the same thing, right? They have done that with charter schools to pretty great effect, actually. Charters in Colorado, at least, were totally not written to try and do something to impact equity in a positive way, but they've been used that way. So I think, you know, it behooves us to start thinking about those kinds of questions. The question I have that goes a step beyond that is, what might we do now making use of this policy that was not created to do things that I primarily things that I care about, to actually rebuild or expand trust in public institutions? Like do something to serve some group of kids better than we are. Again, our system underserves and it's crummy, and we should keep innovating and doing better, and we should be accountable to doing better. Do it to do that. Like how could we use the voucher program to do that? But how could we also use the voucher program to cause people to be in community instead of it becoming a thing that makes things more exclusive, more separated? How could it build community? How could it build trust? How could it build relationship? How could it specifically build better shared understanding of how public assets matter to economic mobility and to stable and expanding middle class in our country? Like, I'm really curious about that.
One of the things that you and I had briefly talked about was this idea of like, if this new system is going to be implemented, maybe the intention is to go one direction, but we potentially could use it to go in a different direction, right? Because it's not there yet, right? Like it's a system that hasn't actually been created, and it's a system that will certainly impact existing systems, but it doesn't necessarily prevent us from creating new systems. And so what I'm really curious about, especially because of the work that you've been doing in this latter half of your career, you know, how are you thinking about these opportunities for reimagining our education system? And how do you think it could function better to reflect some of those groups that you were already referencing? One of the things that I know you're very passionate about is this erosion of like trust in the community, this tension between education systems and communities. And so when you think about reimagining the future of education, what opportunities are you seeing already?
Yeah, well, you know, one thing that is true, like pretty much any time people are surveyed about this, is that Americans distrust public education, but they love their school, like the school their kids go to. I think there's probably lots of reasons for that persistent perception, but one of them is just the most basic thing, which is the difference between what is personal and what is sort of abstract. And I think it's easy to be persuaded to think about a lot of things in the abstract that you wouldn't consider personal, right? So I think that is something to lean into right now. I also think it is our job inside public schools to produce and demonstrate value for the communities we serve. And some of the best work I've been a part of in the last several years of doing this work is when we've done that very explicitly. So I'll give two examples. So one here in Colorado, the Homegrown Talent Initiative, which has grown into the Homegrown Talent Coalition, big initiative supported by the Colorado Education Initiative, CEI, and Colorado Succeeds, that began with a really small number of rural districts. But what we did when we brought them together was help them facilitate local conversations about a graduate profile, as in, like, what are the competencies you care about your young people learning and having when they leave high school? So, I said we'd done that state level before to figure out essential skills. This is sort of like take that locally, figure out what does that mean for you, and bring in business, bring in families, bring in students, bring in community members, bring in, faith leaders in your community, bring in everybody. Talk together about what do you think your kids need to be ready to succeed, whether they're going to stay and grow and work in your community or if they're going to go and work someplace else, which is actually a kind of a heartbreaking conversation to have in a rural community. But we did that. And then it was like, okay, if this is what you think, then what could you do together that would help more kids in your community build these competencies? And what could you do together that is mutually beneficial? And this is actually a lesson that we learned from studying the Swiss youth apprenticeship system, which is that their system isn't like their government doesn't spend money to incentivize people to align in certain behaviors to get the system that they need. They are incredibly user driven and user responsive, right? User centered. So they go out and they figure out, like, hey, if you had apprentices who did XYZ things, what is the value to you as a company of doing that? And they respond, right? The design of their education system is responsive. They actually have made large changes in their system over the last 20 years or so to be more responsive to young people, because young people were starting to, frankly, watch a lot of American movies and think that a four-year degree was like the only way to be successful. And that was damaging to their economy, because their economy actually relies on a large portion of young people going through apprenticeship and becoming highly skilled in a technical way, not so much in a theoretical way. And they were having reduced numbers, which they knew reduces their innovation and reduces their global competitiveness, right? So they could have gone out and they could have been like, hey, students, I know what we're going to do. We're going to pay you more. We're going to do these things. But instead they're like, hey, students, what is the reason you're making this choice? And the reason they were making that choice is they felt like they needed to have a way to get to a four-year degree just in case. And so they created a system that's like super permeable, right? As in, like, you can choose this apprenticeship, then change your mind and go to this university. There's like training you have to do. There's tests you have to pass. It's not without competency requirements, but it doesn't have the same financial or time trade-offs as moving through our system and changing your mind does. All of those changes were made in response to those users. And all of those changes were made in a way that didn't compromise user needs of companies at the same time. So anyway, that core idea of like, make a thing that actually is selfishly good for everyone as best as you can, rather than trying to coerce anybody. We brought that to the Homegrown Talent Initiative. And so in the initial design, it was like, hey, you built this profile together. You obviously all care about this, because we do. We all care about our young people. And it was like, that's the other thing that is like utterly consistent in working in education that makes me inspired and happy all the time, is that anytime you're in a room with people, even if they come for political reasons, eventually you hear real care for young people. And it is a place of meaningful connection for everybody that we can build from. So you come, you do that, you hear local community, you built this profile, and then we ask the question, what could you do together that would be really valuable to you? And they designed different things, some the same things and some different things in these different communities. Sometimes they expanded significantly, like concurrent enrollment, because businesses also were like, man, if kids had these few classes, they'd be a lot more useful to us, right? And so they expanded access to that. Sometimes they built particular programs. There's one district that was part of that initial group that worked with their community to to raise the money to get like a CNA training lab, a nursing training lab, because they had a total nursing shortage and they didn't have a very clear way to offer that pathway, right? And like a school can have a lab and teach some of those CTE courses and get kids early credentials. And that's really useful to everybody, right? So what they did was different, because what they did was what was mutually interesting to them, mutually satisfying to them, mutually valuable to them. And that work has grown all over the state. The leaders of that work, again, Succeeds and CEI have worked with districts to get a lot of state funding to support that. It's scaled to, I think, around half the districts in the state now. Repeating that process, right? Not being like, oh, we should have a CNA lab, but repeating the process of coming together, getting everybody to agree what really are the competencies our young people need, getting everybody to find for themselves what is the collaboration that really makes sense, that really has value for all of us, so that we can offer it now and we can sustain it ourselves over time. I think doing things like that, even in a little scale, right, of a small community inside of a state, those are things that strengthen the half of that narrative that I shared before, right? Like, I think public education's a mess, but my kid's school is great. Okay, I think my kid's school is great because we've done this work together. Starts, I think, to change the story to actually, this system actually works well. It's not just my kid's classroom. It's not my kid's teacher. It's not my kid's principal. It is, this system is actually responsive to me. It's a partner to me. It's serving me and my children well and better than it used to because we are working together. I think local work like that actually can be quite powerful in addressing sort of opportunistic political messages that try and get people to be fearful in the abstract, or even who are feeling some kind of inclination that the system isn't serving them anymore, right? If it is serving you, then you're not that vulnerable to that narrative, which could be totally racially charged and manipulative and gross. We can combat that by actually just being awesome at serving young people in our communities. And then I'll say just one thing tied to that. I said before, the voucher program, one of the things it does not do is it does not require testing or reporting. And there is some opportunity in that too, right? Because the way accountability works right now, like I should, as a teacher, feel most accountable to the children in the classroom with me and to their families. That's where I should feel most accountable. But the way we've built our accountability system, that is in tension with how accountable I feel to following the directions that have been issued to me, that people believe are going to make things better for the children in my classroom, and demonstrating that those things are working on a set of test scores that measure a really narrow set of the things that we actually all care about. And so odd compromises are made, right? Like in Colorado, we initiated state testing like 20 some years ago, reading, writing, math, then science, and we didn't do social studies. Elementary schools stopped teaching social studies. If you're really accountable to a young person and to their family and to your community, of course you're teaching social studies, right? But if you are going to be punished because your reading scores aren't going up, you're going to trade it to get those reading scores, right? So there are some grody incentives in how we are currently holding schools accountable. So when you imagine a process like the Homegrown Talent Initiative, there is a relational accountability that is very different. And I'll say that component is what CIE, Center for Innovation and Education, not to be confused with CEI, which is hilarious. We're all friends and we find our acronyms astonishing, even one another. But at CIE for the last 9 years, that's been what we've really been obsessed with, actually, is what is the way that systems can demonstrate responsiveness to then provide greater value to communities? And how does that change trust? I'm now getting to the second example. I know you can't believe it's been so long and I'm only just getting there now. But the second example I wanted to talk about is both local and state work that we have done to bring people together in communities like Vicksburg, Mississippi, or in Burlington, Vermont, at a local level, forming an inclusive coalition of people that is as diverse or more than the community in all the ways that we could measure diversity, that has supports around it, like childcare and meals and stuff, so that a lot of people can be there who might not naturally be able to be there, offering at a time when they're not missing work, or even offering stipends to folks if they would have to miss work to be there, if they're hourly wage workers and they would have to be. Figuring out how first to get the group to be inclusive, then have them work together to identify what are their priorities, what do they see as the problems, and what actions would be meaningful to them and also are feasible to pull off, right? You can have amazing ideas. Like you go to a design thinking thing and we're all inventing like rocket ships and, space lasers, whatever. That's cool. And I'm all about facilitating creativity. And, ultimately you have to have a thing that is going to feel good enough and also be able to be pulled off so that it does feel good when you implement. And so building those things together, that could be through strategic planning, that could be through redesign of accountability. And I think the way we do that work at CIE, we are intentionally practicing different habits while we do the work, habits that change the power dynamics in a way that we want them to be changed over time, right? That help establish a different way of being in partnership between community and school system, a more responsive relationship between community and school system. We have 4 habits we care very deeply about: inclusion, empathy, co-creation, and reciprocity. And we work really hard to facilitate those processes with those habits, including things like, by the time we got to, I think it was the second meeting of the coalition in Kentucky, we had a member of the community who was a parent facilitate the connection activity at the start of our meeting, right? Because if we're going to co-create this together, then you need to be visibly leading it just as much as I or anybody else does, right? So we're like incredibly intentional about how we design and facilitate the way we do that work. We call out and talk about, are we in line with these habits? We pause and reflect, like, are we doing it right? How is it feeling right now? Try to help the leaders that we work with understand that that's how you can operate always. And, we have so many things in our structures and actually in governance. We've become recently quite obsessed with governance actually at CIE. Robert's rules are like the default set of ways you run a board meeting, for example, and they are called the Robert's Rules of Order. They are meant to create order in public spaces. And you should have some order for sure in public, like it's not a bad thing. But they do preserve a particular pattern of power that may prevent you from learning what the underlying issues are, and therefore may prevent you from actually solving problems that everybody cares about, right? They also don't feel great. If you're like on the, low end of the dais in the board meeting, you're being looked down upon, they feel crappy. But also it probably practically prevents you from actually sincerely understanding what's going on and therefore making good decisions and governing well. And so, from like an inclusive process to do some visioning together, which then led to redesign of accountability in Kentucky or a strategic plan in Vicksburg, Mississippi, we're running these processes with these different habits. We're trying to get people to see, you could apply these to governance afterwards. You could apply these to how you're going to hold one another accountable to the implementation of the plans you're making now. And it wouldn't hurt you to continue to be inclusive and empathetic while you're implementing so that you get some user feedback, right? Being user-centered is to public education. And again, our accountability system almost explicitly discourages you from being user-centered. There's problems with being user-centered while being a biased person. That's how we had systems that were grossly inequitable before we had all this testing, right? Like you can't pretend that's not there. And I think you have to do something to disrupt that. So we work on those habits, and then actually we have some work we've been testing in partnership with Allen County, Kentucky, to be able to measure actually in a legitimate way changes in people's perception of like how often, how reliably, and in what ways those habits are playing out in the work and how that's changing their trust, right? So if I was part of the design team in Allen County and I was included in XYZ processes, I co-created something or another, it turns out that I feel better about the quality of the work. I feel like it's better work. I feel like the habits were in place, and I better trust the people to implement the work that I helped co-create. These are not like shocking findings necessarily, but it really matters that we can like collect data and talk about that, right? In school systems that are accustomed to only caring about standardized test data, we're offering a very different set of data for leaders to consider, again, in partnership with their communities, right? So I think CIE is figuring out some pretty special things right now about how to help people do things like the Homegrown Talent Initiative did, right? How to help them do things that maybe are mundane, like, oh, you have to do a strategic plan. Like lots of states are like, you have to, every 5 years, you must make one. Cool. Could you do that mundane thing in a way that you try to change your habits in a way that you begin to establish a new way of working with your community? And might you want to collect data about those habits and trust over time? So that strategic planning is the beginning of you doing things differently. It's the beginning of you having different ways to be accountable and making accountability happen at a local level in a way that has a lot of reciprocity. And then back to your big question, if we did that a lot of places, would that change people's perception of the legitimacy and value of public education? And I think the answer is yes. I think fighting this battle about legitimacy in a conversational way, in a policy and political arena, is probably not going to be effective. But I think at home in communities of various sizes, again, there just are some things that I have seen to always be true. People of all different backgrounds with various views about what public education should be doing all care about their young people. They all want a system that is responsive to them. When they come and they're asked to empathize with others, they realize that it's more complex than they thought. And they're willing to compromise because they actually don't only want their needs met at the expense of their neighbor. They're more caring than that. So if you bring them together, you ask them to empathize with one another, and you ask them to co-create solutions and then be connected to each other and keep track of their habits and how trust is changing, things improve in that place. And I think their perception of the system also really changes.
It's really clear as we talk about all this, Gretchen, how we're sitting at this intersection of the personal, the professional, the political. And a lot of what I hear you saying is that this really begins with human-centered design and also a lot of intentionality. And while those things are very simple, we both know that those are actually very complex, and that if anyone could solve those, they would be a billionaire, because it's the same problems that we see in lots of different industries and lots of different layers of our professional and political ecosystem. And so I guess I kind of sit here now with this question. It's like, if I'm someone listening to this right now and I'm just like, wow, this is a lot, and it was something I wasn't maybe that aware of, but now I know and I feel like I should do something. But gosh, where do I even start?
Well, I'm going to start with educators first, and then I'll get to others. Another thing that underlies a lot of this, like the dynamic I was describing before of what the system is really serving, who it's really accountable to, the source of legitimacy as a teacher or as a principal or as a superintendent or even a state chief of education. The source of your legitimacy ought to be the degree to which you're a trusted partner with the community that you serve. That isn't the habit of our system. So anybody could start doing this differently. So the habit of our system is, I have a diploma from a place. I actually used to have them hanging in my office, and I took them down a few years ago because I was like, actually, I don't really want that to be why you want to work with me. But that's how we have had legitimacy historically. We are professionals. We have expertise. There are policies telling us certain things. We are accountable to those policies and are meant to do these things in service of what we collectively think we know is right and best and good. And no matter how well-intentioned all of that is, and I think lots of it is, and no matter how true a bunch of it is, I do have particular expertise. I've studied really hard to understand how children learn and grow. That's not irrelevant. It's not unimportant. It's just, it's not the only reason someone should trust me to teach their child, right? They should trust me to teach their child because I have expertise, but also because I am curious, I am empathetic, and I have some degree of humility, which means I believe you also have expertise. You have some experience with your child that I don't have. And to be honest, I don't think I understood these things as well until I became a parent myself. There's probably a better way to teach young teachers about this than however I was taught. I was innately curious about kids, and that got me a long way in my classroom. And that's just my nature. I find them fascinating. All of them, all the time. But I could have had more humility. I really felt I needed to have a barrier of expertise sometimes to deal with families because I was insecure. I didn't know how to do that differently. So I think if you're an educator sitting in any spot anywhere and you have been using policy, authority, certifications and expertise to be the basis of your legitimacy with children and families. Try to expand that to include curiosity, humility, connection, responsiveness, and relationship, which means openly acknowledging when you don't know what the right thing to do is instead of always professing your expertise, right? Like, I don't know, there were times in my classroom, I mean, I still do it now, but there were times in my classroom when I just stopped teaching and was like, is this working for anyone? I don't think so. And they're like, oh, thank God. No, it's totally not working. Please stop, you know? And I think we're not comfortable doing that very often. And I think I was comfortable doing that with kids. I was not comfortable enough to do that with families. And I think that was a real limitation of my own practice as a teacher. I'm much more comfortable doing that with everybody now. But that's because I've learned that actually my legitimacy with them grows when I'm willing to be vulnerable. So if you're an educator, start trying some ways to be more vulnerable with one another, with kids, and with families. I think it goes a very long way toward this whole thing. And then if you're a community member and you're reading stuff about your school system, I think the first thing probably is also bring some empathy and some curiosity. And before making judgments, maybe go learn some things. And learn some things from all kinds of people. Like if you're feeling strongly about something, I'm glad. I'm glad when there are people who don't have kids in schools who are feeling strongly about public education. We need everybody to see this as a public asset that is meant to be delivering value to them. So I'm glad you're feeling strongly. Now go be empathetic and go learn from people and learn about the complexity of the situation. Learn about the cares and desires of your neighbors, whether they're the same or different than your own, and engage in some of that. And, I would say school structures don't make that easy necessarily, but even doing it outside of those structures, just doing it personally is of tremendous value, right? Just talking to neighbors, just talking to a few teachers inside a school and talking to them with sincere curiosity. Those interactions themselves, I believe, have impact. Whether you're part of a public meeting and a board makes a different decision or whatever. I will say anytime I sit down and do an empathy interview with a teacher or with a parent or with a student, they feel better about whatever they're doing just for having had someone listen to them for a half an hour. And I learned something really important. So if you're outside the system and you have strong feelings, go have some curious conversations and listen to folks. It's a service unto itself, and it will definitely help you better understand so you can figure out what action it is you want to take.
Gretchen, there are so many things that we probably could dive deeper on and spend like another hour on a dozen different topics. But we are coming near the end of the show. And I like to wrap each episode by saying, if someone said this was way too long, I did not listen, what's one thing you'd want them to take away from our conversation?
I would want them to take away that public education is part of a bigger picture and that public assets matter for impacting equity and access to middle-class life, and that young people are an asset we should all care about. I think that's what I would say.
Well, on that note, we will end this episode. Thank you so much, Gretchen, for being on the show.
That was my pleasure, Heather. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode and are seeking to redefine success on your own terms, subscribe to Small Acts of Rebellion and join a community that celebrates authenticity and personal growth.